Okay, gang, here we go with the brief narration of some notes from Chapter 9 that you're hopefully going to use for quiz number 3 coming up during the later part of this week. So I'm going to go ahead and just walk you through some of the notes, some things we hit on last week with our Zoom sessions. I invite you to go back and review those Zoom sessions, definitely. If you need to pick up on some other notes on those, especially when we talked about feudalism early last week. And these notes today will focus more heavily on the back end of Chapter 9's notes, dealing with things like William's implementation of feudal government and the blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norman culture into essentially what we understand as English culture in the late Middle Ages. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing the screen right now with you on that. And we can go ahead and get started and walk through some of the notes here. So again, looking at feudalism in the Middle Ages, the height of the Middle Ages. This is interesting because we're now at what's seen as the Middle Ages kind of moves in an arc, sort of like a parabola, okay? And it reaches a point, what is considered by medieval historians as the height of the Middle Ages, and those are usually seen as the dates between 900 and 1200. The reason that is because towards the back end of the Middle Ages, you get that, kind of apropos for things in the modern world, the Black Plague, which starts to creep up in the 1300s. And that sort of draws to a close the Middle Ages on the back end. But the height of the Middle Ages is generally seen as this time period that we're heading into right now. So if you're looking at the notes here, we talked a lot last week about the feudal relationships of lord and vassal. We talked about a bunch of these different things during last week's Zoom session. Okay, we talked about oaths and fealty, and we read some sources. You guys did a CPA on it. So a lot of this is just summation. The big word again that we wanted to talk about, which comes into play a lot during the Middle Ages, is this word SubInfuriation. Okay, so make sure you have an understanding of what that means. That's the division of a fief. For instance, if someone were to parcel out a piece of land, for instance, as a fief, then that person could, if the land was large enough, could divide that up and himself become a lord to a lower vassal. A very complicated set of allegiances develops as a result of that. And towards the bottom, we talked about this briefly last week. Where's the church in all of this? The church definitely tries its hardest to get some grips around it, because you can't just have, if you can imagine how complicated the series of SubInfuriation was and how people could just parcel out and fief out and become the vassal of this person, the vassal of that person, how that would create rivalries and it would create intense, violent situations sometimes. And the church tried, with the peace and the truce of God, and we talk about that in chapter 9, to say that certain people are off limits, and certain time periods like Lent and the lead up to Easter and Advent and the lead up to Christmas, those are off time periods. And unless you want to incur the wrath of God and go to hell for all eternity, then we're not going to be doing fighting during this time period. And that, as much as we laugh at it now, that held a pretty large sway over people in the Middle Ages. Also, make sure you pick it up on pages 245 and 46. They talk about chivalry and how that develops over time, and how it becomes a tool of social exclusiveness, and how if you have so many people that are knights and fiefed and vassals to him and vassal to him, you have to figure out a way to differentiate the upper crust from the lower crust. Human beings are always trying to do that. They're always trying to figure out ways to divide and subdivide themselves up. So the knights who could trace your lineage back hundreds of years, develop the coat of arms. They call it in your book an esprit de corps, meaning that you figure out that you're part of this in club, all right? And we do this in the modern world. If you want to think of like country clubs, there's country clubs that you can belong to, and then there's country clubs that you can belong to. For instance, you can belong to, over by Thomas More, you have, what is that? Summit Hills Country Club. It's a nice country club, all right? And it costs a lot to join. That's a country club. But then there's like country clubs like Augusta National, or Muirfield up in Columbus. Those are the country clubs. I mean, you got to be a certain next level up in the social crust to have enough money and enough connections. It's not even about money with Augusta National. You have to have social connections. You have to be part of the kind of the old boy network to get into Augusta National. And be able to play that course. So that's exactly what is a good modern equivalent to what chivalry is all about. Can you trace your lineage back 3 to 4 to 5 generations and say that you are a part of this special group to differentiate yourself from the nouveau riche, the new knights, the lower knights who can't possibly have been able to trace their lineage back that far? We talked about this last week, the Bayeux Tapestry. It's one of the foremost important documents to all medieval historians. Again, written from the Norman perspective. The video talked about it. If you need a little update on that, watch the video. I've also placed within this link that I'm giving you guys today, and as well in the email, very helpful links to other sources about the Bayeux Tapestry, including the ones from the Khan Academy. And these are really helpful, short, quick reads and quick links from the Khan Academy and also from the BBC to help you bolster, round out your understanding and knowledge of the Bayeux Tapestry. So I'll let those speak for themselves, as well as our look last week at how important the Bayeux Tapestry was to the construction of this story. Remember, the Bayeux Tapestry, essentially, this whole story starts back, as the English, if you're looking at what was called the Danelaw, all right, the English had always had a interesting situation dealing with Viking invasions, okay, and dating all the way back to, when we talk about this at the beginning of chapter 9, the first English king, Alfred, essentially bought off the Vikings, just as the French, as the Franks bought off the land of Normandy, so the English bought off this land known as the Danelaw. Okay, and so this comes back into play, and the reason I showed this slide is this comes back into play at the end of our discussion here, and why maybe you were wondering why Harold is charging his army north to fight off a Viking invasion. You're probably like, where the heck did that come from? Well, this is where it came from. The Danes, the Vikings from Denmark, always felt that this middle part of England, kind of from London down here, all right, you have London down here, and then York up here, where it was always generally seen as the separating mark between the northern part of England and what would become Scotland. The Danes always felt that this part of England was theirs. And that's interesting to the story as we move forward, certainly. Again, if you're looking at, and I'll move this over to here for a bit. This is, again, a snippet from the Bayeux Tapestry that we pulled out here, and this is William, and we'll come back and we'll talk about that in a bit. remember, the whole story with the Norman invasion kind of starts with a guy named Edward the Confessor. I'm just briefly going to go through this. If you need, again, some bolstering of this, watch that BBC video, the Normans episode 1, to bolster this back up. But page 260 in your text talks about it. Edward the Confessor was elected by this English group known as the Witan or the Witan, depending on how you want to say it, doesn't matter. But the interesting thing is that the English, keep in mind with this thing known as the Witan, they had always had some sense of independence in what the English called their shires. Okay, so what this was they would come together and they would elect kings. When William gets on the scene, he's not going to have any type of decision being made by a conglomeration of shires coming together to figure something out. This is like a kind of a proto parliament. English common law always would go back to the Witan as their kind of founding group of what it was, how things were supposed to be. The English will eventually get back to this when we get to this Magna Carta and other things that will be signed by the few generations off from William. We'll get to that a little bit later on in our story. So again, you have this Anglo-Saxon king, elected. His name is Harold Godwinson. We talked about this, and we did mention the shipwreck controversy from last week. We talked about that on Thursday. So the story goes that the King Harold Godwinson, who was elected by the Witan in 1066, when he's elected, William, all right, and I'll come down here and I'll click on William. William basically said, no, back, a decade earlier, Harold had wrecked his ship in 1064, so a few years earlier, had wrecked his ship and pledged the fact that if he were elected king, which he was, that he would bequeath this territory to William, because William had essentially saved him and his ship from foundering out there on the coast of Normandy. Remember, this whole situation is because Edward the Confessor dies without an heir, and so in this situation, you also have to start to remember that heirs, male heirs especially, are becoming very important to these dynasties, to these generational and genealogical dynasties that are passing within families. So that whole situation is kicked off from the fact that he doesn't have an heir. Again, use that linked secondary source for aid here if you need a little help picking up on those notes. But William takes advantage of the fact that Harold has to run north to Stamford Bridge in September of 1066 to fight off a invasion now from the Norwegians, who were like coming in and trying to take over part of that Danelaw that they felt that they were a part of. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on that, why the Norwegians would feel that they were entitled to part of the Danelaw, but that's again a whole other part of Scandinavian history. But the long and the short of it is that you have a guy named Harold Hardrada. Now, I don't want to get, again, like I said, too far into the weeds here, because you got Harold Godwinson on this side and you got Harold Hardrada from Norway invading. The part that I find terribly interesting, though, is down here. You have Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig, and it's a really interesting kind of Game of Thronesy story that we get from this, and they don't talk about it too much on the video, so I'll tell you just a little bit about it. Harold Godwinson had a younger brother named Tostig, and Tostig felt passed over. He felt that he should have been given part of the territory as well, instead of just his brother Harold getting all of it. So Tostig treacherously goes behind his brother's back and makes a deal with the Norwegian king Viking herald Hardrada and says, Harold, I will aid your invasion of England if, when you take it over, you will give some of the land to me, kind of like a feudal vassal. So he literally stabs his brother in the back, does Tostig. And Harold Godwinson's armies, while they do, and they're able to fight off the Norwegian invasion at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, they are completely and utterly exhausted by the time William's army invades October 14, 1066. Okay, and this is again what you see from this awesome clip and snippet from the Bayeux Tapestry. All right, the video talks about how you can differentiate between Norman soldiers and English soldiers, Anglo-Saxon soldiers, and you can see they're all wearing, again, this tightly knitted. Sometimes it was leather, sometimes it was a little bit heavier chainmail type protection. You can see flying projectiles, you can see the arrows, and you can see again the mounted heavy horse cavalry of William of Normandy, who was able to kind of run right through. The video made it, because again, it's a BBC production, they made it sound a little bit closer than it was, the battle. This battle was more of a rout from the Norman perspective. That brings us to this, probably the most important part of what we want to talk about, guys, going forward, is this book right here, okay, which is outlined on page 265 of your main textbook. This is what's known as the Doomsday Book, or the Doomsday Book, however you want to pronounce it. More often pronounced the Doomsday Book. When William begins to implement his control of now conquered Anglo-Saxon territory, what he does is nothing short of a cultural revolution. All right. Norman culture is imposed by any means necessary. Okay. And that will include a lot of different things that we're going to look at here in the notes. This was not, some people have described it, some medieval historians have, described it as a genocide. It was not genocidal at all. William did not commit genocide on the Anglo-Saxon population because he needed them to pay taxes. He needed them to fund his military. He needed them to work the land. So don't think of it like that. It was, however, a cultural genocide, if you want to, I guess, if you want to use that word. Anglo-Saxon culture is kind of done away with by the right of Norman conquest. Feudal governing practices are imposed, again, by any means necessary. Pages 263 and 64 talk about this in your book. And I quote from page 263 in that paragraph there at the bottom: the distribution of fiefs in England took place rapidly and according to plan, since all the land belonged to the king by right of conquest. So were all fiefs held either directly or indirectly by the throne. Skip down to the bottom of that paragraph. There was relatively little SubInfuriation. This was the right of conquest of William, to distribute the land to whomever he saw fit, however he saw fit to do it. Remember, when William needed to put together an army to invade Anglo-Saxon England, he promised lots and lots of people, if you come with me, there will be a land that you will receive. I will fief it out to you, and you will become owners of this new land. That's how he was able to kind of advertise and get people over to his army, his invading army, to take over the Anglo-Saxons in 1066. All previous land, this is the interesting thing, all previous land was confiscated and redistributed by William by right of conquest, and Anglo-Saxon ownership of land was destroyed. Okay, this was now William's territory, and he was parceling it out as Norman fief. Now, what the interesting thing is as page 263 talks about, right? William distributed lands to approximately 180 leading nobles. Okay, mostly Normans, but with a few Anglo-Saxons thrown in. That's the thing, where he wasn't a complete and utter hardhead here. This was very Machiavellian. Now, Machiavelli will come about with the prince in how to govern during the Renaissance ages, but this is very Machiavellian, meaning that he's not going to, he understands certain areas of this place that he just took over are going to be more ripe for rebellion than others. And in those areas, he will use Anglo-Saxon leadership. He will use Anglo-Saxon, he will fief out the land to an Anglo-Saxon in areas where he feels the people are going to be a little more disposed to paying attention and being okay with this situation. In other areas, he will just simply impose a Norman foreigner upon the land. Religious practice, guys, the best word that you can think about when you come up to this is what's called a royal theocracy. Page 264 talks about it right in the middle of the page. Okay, the new regime proved both generous to the church and dismissive of it. That is exactly how William intended it. Okay, this is royal theocracy. What that means is the government, okay, the royal, all right, is in charge of the church. Okay, the government of William and then his ilk and generations out into the future will govern England. They will see the church essentially as a fief of their territory. Okay, and the church isn't going to like this. Your chapter talks about it there at the bottom of page 264. For the time being, the Holy See, meaning the Roman Catholic Church, could do nothing about this. Okay, now they will try and they'll try and they'll try in the future to tell these now English kings, okay, these Norman, and then eventually they'll become the kings of England, right? That it's the church's land and you're holding it essentially by the right of God. It's actually the church's land and we're fiefing it out to you. And the English kings are always like, no, the church, you exist on our land essentially as a vassal, okay? It says right here in the middle of that paragraph on page 264, the crown made it clearly understood that the churches themselves were in fact vassals of the king, okay? And they were generous to the church, all right? They were very generous to the church. They talked about this, all right? Ultimately, the crown gave roughly 1/5, that's a lot of land, 1/5 of England's land that William just conquered to religious houses. Okay, so he gives a lot of that land to monasteries, to churches, all right? And William himself made sure that, you know, Catholicism was practiced all throughout his territory, and William's generations after made sure that that was practiced. However, all right, there will be a strain running through English monarchical thinking that will run through the Middle Ages and up into the Renaissance and early modern times, where now it doesn't seem so unbelievable and implausible when we talk about the story of Henry VIII, where he basically just says to the Pope, well, why can't I get a divorce? I'm in charge of this land, and basically tells the Catholic Church, I'm going to form my own church, the Anglican Church, if you don't let me do what I want to do, because this is my land, okay? And that's exactly how English kings, all the way back now to William, are going to feel about the church. This is mine. It's my territory, and you, church, you exist here as one of my vassals. Language is interesting. Page 264, 65 talks about this. Norman French replaced Anglo-Saxon as the language of the court and the government. For 200 years after 1066, no king of England could speak English or would even admit to it. All right, that's how dominant this cultural imposition was. Okay, and you get all kinds of new words that come out of it, blending of French words, blending of some even Scandinavian words, and blending of Old English words, and it will become, as your book talks about in 265, what we know as Middle English, where we start to see words that we understand in the works of Chaucer, all right, Canterbury Tales, all that stuff. We start to understand and look at words and be like, I kind of know what that means, even if it is what we understand as mispronounced or wrongly spelled. We could look at the word now in Middle English, and that is because it will be a blend over time of Norman imposition of French words into English Anglo-Saxon culture. We've talked about this briefly, but I want to mention it again. The Shire, the local independence of the Shire, is completely eradicated. All right. Prior to this, the Shires had some local governmental structures. There was a reeve of the Shire, a person who was in charge. Eventually, that word we know now as the Shire reeve, the sheriff. Okay, that local independence is completely eradicated by the imposition of this gigantic inventory / census in 1086 called the Doomsday Book. All right. It's called the Doomsday Book because the survey, this inventory was so large, so vast, so expansive, and so grand in its scope that the English used a word called dooms, which is known as Judgment Day. Okay, Doomsday in Old English is known as Judgment Day. So it was the Book of Judgment Day. Essentially, people saw this as extensive as the Judgment Day would be. Okay, that this is it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It just means that this book was so big and so expansive. It was as if God himself was coming down to take an inventory of English culture. It is an inventory, like I said, of all revenue within his realm. So what I've done here is I've also linked a really cool source from the medieval source book that I want you to go, and you can pause this now and go read it, look at it, and just see how extensive this was, that it was down to, again, the last little bits of taxable wealth. What can I tax? Because I need to be able to fund my army. All right, I need to be able to make sure that my government is imposed by any means necessary. And the best way to do that is find out what I got, what can I tax, all right, and who can give more, who's holding out on me. And that was one of the big things that you're going to read in that source. They talk about how this is supposed to be carried out. And basically what it says in one of the lines is I want to know if somebody can give a little more than what they've been giving me. It's really interesting how that is carried out. So make sure you read about that, pages 265 and 266. The interesting thing that I will mention from page 266 is that it says right here, all right, among other things which we could point out, the survey known as the Doomsday Book drove home one powerful specific statistic. Top of page 266, well more than 3/4 of the people in the countryside were listed, legally classified as serfs. This basically says feudal government has now been completely and utterly implemented onto English society in 20 years, okay? He took over in 1066. By 1086, what this is telling historians is that it took 20 years, essentially a generation, for Norman culture to completely wipe out many of the vestiges of Anglo-Saxon culture. And what had happened now was that feudal government had been completely and utterly implemented onto former Anglo-Saxon territory. It was now Norman England, right? And the land that had been owned a lot by local shires and people had been eradicated. That land was now owned by the local lord, the landlord, and parceled out however he saw fit. All right, so that brings to a close those notes. All right, I'll stop sharing the screen there. All right, so hopefully you guys can view this, use this for your notes for upcoming quiz number 3. All right, and hopefully view this either tonight before we get into the Zoom room tomorrow, or tomorrow before we get in there, or afterwards. Doesn't really matter, but hopefully you'll use this as a good walkthrough of your notes. All right, and I'll see you guys in the classroom tomorrow morning. Until then, take care, everybody.